think saying I'm agnostic is too much of a throwaway statement. I, through my own deep thinking in astrophysics and philosophy, has led me to conclude that there are things about the cosmos that we don't understand and that possibly we can never understand. And maybe that means there's a higher power of some kind. But I'm also not quite able to make the jump from knowing there are things we don't understand or can't possibly understand to sort of a God of the gaps fallacy. And so I don't quite make that jump, but that landscape is open to me. And I spend a lot of time thinking about it from the intellectual perspective. I grew up in my formative years as a child deeply, deeply religious, but not because I was part of a religious family. My extended family was fairly conservative and religious, but I grew up in a with a single mom, and we were very, very poor. And my mom had no interest. She didn't even pretend to be religious, right? She wouldn't even, go to church and pretend to blend in. I would go to church on my own. People would drive me, or my mom would drop me off when I was a child. And as soon as I was able to drive, I just did everything on my own. But I think for me, I I'm laughing because I'm like, how do I address this in a way that is fair and true, without making this about me, because I don't want this to be about me. Um, but some of the backstory here that I think is important to understanding where I'm coming from is actually really deeply personal in a way that is kind of uncomfortable to share, but I will. So as I said, I grew up with a single mom, and we were super poor. And by that I mean we didn't always, for example, have electricity or a phone or running water, kind of poor. And especially in my early childhood, I remember not, coming home and having food left on the front step for us because people didn't know if we would be able to eat. Um, and my mom, she did her best. I think being a single parent is really, really hard. And my heart goes out to all the single parents out there. Um, but it was stressful, and she didn't have a support network, and so she became alcoholic, or maybe she always was alcoholic, I don't know. And that resulted in, a range of different kinds of abuse. And one of the things that came out of this, I promise I'm going somewhere with this that is related to the question you asked, is that particularly when she was intoxicated, she made a point of telling me that she wished she'd had an abortion. And so um, I grew up like deeply embedded in my own sensibility that I wasn't I wasn't wanted, and in some senses I shouldn't have existed. And so for me, the only avenue I had available to me as a child was religion to try to understand my place in the universe. And so deeply embedded in my psychology from my childhood um, as an impulsion to try to understand my place in the universe. Like it's not negotiable. Like that is like what makes me tick. So as a child, we had maybe a dozen books in the house, but three of them were different copies of the Bible. And I read all of them over and over and over. And I could quote scripture with the best of them, right? In whatever version you want, from King James to the Good News Bible. Like I had them all. Um, and I was convinced at that time that the only way I was going to find out of the trajectory I was on was through religion. If I was a good enough person, if I prayed hard enough, if I believed hard enough, if I repented hard enough, if I did all of the things that one could do, that was going to be the path that got me out of the trajectory I was on. And so I really was, but I want to be clear, that was the only avenue that was available to me. And I think that's true for many people in their early childhoods, right? They have what is available to them and they don't have a lot of choice in it. Now, clearly, over the intervening decades, my religious belief and my spiritual perspective has evolved, in many different ways as I've become exposed to new ways of thinking and new ideas and deep thought about our place in the universe. Um, but I wouldn't. I think saying I'm agnostic is too much of a throwaway statement. I, through my own deep thinking in astrophysics and philosophy, has led me to conclude that there are things about the cosmos that we don't understand and that possibly we can never understand. And maybe that means there's a higher power of some kind. Um, but I'm also not quite able to make the jump from knowing there are things we don't understand or can't possibly understand to sort of a God of the gaps fallacy. And so I don't quite make that jump, but that landscape is open to me. And I spend a lot of time thinking about it from the intellectual perspective. So I don't know if that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from intellectually, but what's really important to me, and I really do try my level best to stay intellectually humble about it and intellectually curious, right? To really be forthright about what I can say that I know and what I'm sure that I don't know and what possibilities are open and what we don't know.
That's beautiful and tragic and sad, but wonderful at the same time because my story is somewhat inverse of yours. We had a Bible in my house growing up. I thought as a child that it would burn your hands if you touched it. Don't ask me where that came from.
Were you in a
That was
family of
all.
vampires? Like, what
I
was it?
no normal secular mom and dad kind of thing. But like your mom, my dad kind of gave up on me. Never said what he was verbally somewhat abusive as I got older. Not physically as I can remember, though there were incidents. But he committed suicide when I was a teenager.
Oh
So that was
God.
kind of like saying, "I don't want you," right?
Yeah.
And I was not raised in any sort of Christian household, except when I was in high school. I was put in foster care, and the foster care family was Catholic. They had 9 kids. Not all of them were at home at the time, but I was, child number 10 basically. But the mom of the family would read the Bible to me sometimes. I didn't become a Christian at that point. It wasn't until almost 10 years later, as an adult, that I became a Christian. So I'm an adult convert to Christianity. But as a child, God got me interested in the universe and stars through Carl Sagan. I was
Mhm.
fascinated by Cosmos when I was 11 or 12 when it came out. I was like, this is if this is it. Space. Why aren't we talking more about space? This is fascinating. So
Mhm.
God used that to sort of give me a base for theism in general. That I, as a child, without any upbringing, once when I was a young child, my dad asked us all as kids to explain what Christmas meant. Instead of giving us toy lists, he said, "Write down what Christmas means." He wanted to see what his sons thought. I have 3 younger brothers. So I don't know, I was 9 or 10 at the time, and I said, is all about the birth of Jesus Christ. I don't know where that came from. At 9 years old, I had never been catechized, never really been to a church, really. So, at an early age, I think the first time I heard the gospel, I was 7. It was a Charlie Brown Christmas. And God spoke through Linus's soliloquy
Wow.
when he drops
That's
the blanket. Have
fascinating.
you ever noticed that when he's talking about Jesus, he drops the blanket?
I
He's
have not noticed that.
yeah, his security blanket is dropped when he talks about the
Interesting.
birth of Jesus in Luke's narrative. But so anyway, I can totally relate to your story on many levels, and so I have had a childhood fascination with astronomy, which God used to bring me to Him at some point in my adult life. So thank you for sharing that. I think your approach to intellectual humility is duly noted. We have a lot of people on the book club, Christians and atheists, and even ourselves. We tend to get a little haughty and entrenched in our biases when we are dialoguing with the opposite side.
Mhm.
But it's really taken the edge off of me to be a part of that and to have these conversations with people that don't think like I do. So, like yourself, I have explored these things intellectually. But
Isn't
let's.
curiosity important though? I mean, I
Oh
feel
my
like
gosh, you
approaching each
can't.
other with curiosity is the most opening way to possibly do things. And
Right?
how can we not be curious?
Did you grow up? Did you ever read Arnold Lebel's stories? Frog and
No.
Toad. Frog and
Oh,
Toad.
yes. Yes, yes, yes. Frog and
Yeah,
Toad.
I just wrote an article for my Substack about a story from Mouse Soup. It's a collection of tales, and it's about 2 stones on a hillside that are sad because they can't see what's on the other side of the hill.
Oh,
And I think it reminded me of about what your book is, in a
yeah.
sense that we tend to want to hold on to our biases, and the tragedy of it is whether we believe in God or not, that we live unexamined lives, and we'd rather protect our epistemic happiness rather than we don't have confidence in what we believe, so we don't want to listen to other people. In a sense, and I'm speaking from experience.
Mhm.
and I think that leads to a lot of sorrow because we're envious of other people who think we know more than they do or they know more than we do. But that epistemic humility comes from a sense of confidence in being able to say, I don't know a lot. Even as a Christian, I think I say I don't know a lot. It doesn't mean, and I'm in the business of Christian apologetics where I'm defending the Christian faith. And I say I don't know a lot. And I'm okay with that because I think, as you say, Kelsey, there are things about this world that I don't think we ever can know. I think there's the scripture in Ecclesiastes that says God has made everything beautiful in its time, but he has put eternity into the hearts of man so that he will never be able to find out from beginning to end what God has done. And so your book was kind of a reminder of that to me, that you did an eloquent job of explaining the unknowns. And so many times I think we're told by science popularizers that this or that fact is settled. You name it. You pick a subject, star formation, the beginning of the universe, the Hubble constant, gravity, or whatever the case may be. You get the idea that we've figured this all out, and that's the end of the story. Everybody's just sort of leaning toward a brute fact epistemology. Well, that's just the way it is. Stop questioning that, right? I've heard people say this, professionals in the field saying, well, it's just a brute fact. And it just as a curiosity killer, just because we don't know something doesn't mean that we can't explore it. It just means that we do have limits as epistemically finite people. So let's talk about these epistemic limits as it relates to the cosmos, what we want to be talking about, right? In your take, is the best explanation on the table presently that our time and space had a beginning?
I don't know that there is a best explanation. So I would sort of deflect your question in that way, saying that one of the hypotheses on the table is that time had a beginning with the creation of the universe. But I think that is very much an open question because we can't. One of the things that is really I think interesting to me, and I hope interesting to your book clubs, are what the limits of science are. And at the moment, we have a very strong limit to where empirical inquiry can take us with respect to that question. And, if we are being intellectually honest and humble, which I really want all of us to be, we don't know. We don't know, and it's possible that we can never know. Now, I want to be very careful about never saying something is impossible because 100 years ago we would have said things that are impossible that are totally possible now, and so I want to always leave space for things to be possible in the future. But as far as we can tell right now, with our current understanding of physics and reality, I don't know if we can ever know if time had a beginning. But it is one of the hypotheses on the table. Now, philosophically, that gets us, and not just philosophically and linguistically, that gets us into a very tricky situation once we talk about if time had a beginning. But the flip side of that is also interesting, right? If time didn't have a beginning and if time has been eternal. And having read my book, you know that I have a whole chapter on time and the different philosophical positions, and they have spiritual and religious implications. And I love, Saint Augustine was so
Yeah,
funny on this, right?
it's perfect.
What was God doing before he created the universe? And this is the account is actually fairly apocryphal, and this is not exactly what he said, but in the urban legend version of what St. Augustine said, of course, was he was creating hell for people who pry into the mysteries, right? But
Yeah,
there's a
right.
real question here about if time is infinite and never had a beginning, why did the universe begin when it did? And why has everything not run down? And so there are a lot of real, I think, meaty, good questions here that bring us to the limits of our understanding about what time is as a dimension that are I want to invite people to not dismiss as hard to think about or maybe even outside of our ability to think about, because if we don't think about it, we're never going to figure it out. And there's a lot of really good stuff there about the nature of
Right,
reality.
right. I think Augustine also said, I know what time is until you ask me to explain it.
Exactly.
Right,
Right.
right. So that's interesting. You make a distinction in the book, and you just did, between empirical knowledge and what we might call metaphysical or philosophical knowledge. And
Mhm.
I know in reading a lot of the popular, my knowledge of science and physics is dangerous because it's all popular level stuff. I never studied it in grad school, but I wish I had been more of an studious mathematician as a child. I cried when I had to do long division in fourth grade, so that was the end of my.
Jeez.
It was
Didn't we
awful.
all? I
Yeah,
mean,
fat tears on my long division, and Mrs. Merck in
yeah.
fourth grade taking my hand and making me do long division. But I've since come to appreciate it as an adult. But I think, especially at the popular level, the stuff that you read, Kelsey, is there's a confusing, ambiguous blending of that
Mhm.
border between empirical and philosophical knowledge. And a
Mhm.
lot of times I think there's a lot of metaphysics and philosophy brought into scientific explanations, but the physicists and the scientists that are doing this aren't telling you that's what it is. They're just saying this is
Mhm.
science, and therefore we can conclude. But a lot of the conclusions are of the philosophical and metaphysical stripe. So it seems like you're
Mhm.
saying on an empirical level, we just don't have enough viable empirical evidence to suggest that we know for certain how the universe came to be. Is that accurately summarizing what you're trying to
Oh,
say?
that is 100% summarizing what I'm trying to say. And it's not just that we don't have. Sorry, squirrels running around in my brain because
That's okay.
a
I have
couple
them too.
different ways.
They're in my yard all the time.
There are a couple different ways I want to approach this. One is that I do want to make sure to disentangle a couple the way the word Big Bang is used because I think
Yeah, Fred Hoyle
this
didn't do
this
us any justice when he said
no,
that.
that was really kind of a disaster. But
It
I
was
think there is
right.
a conflation often in the colloquial usage of the word Big Bang. That many people often think Big Bang means the creation of the universe, and it doesn't, right? What the Big Bang itself refers to is a radical period of inflation of some pre existing nugget of a universe, whatever that might have been. Where that original nugget of a universe that was inflated came from, that is a deeper underlying question. And so I want to make sure to just disentangle what we mean when we say Big Bang.
Yeah, Christians
Because,
and myself, I for years. Well, that's the primordial explosion
hmm
of the universe, thanks to Fred Hoyle's language. But really, there was no. I mean, if particles aren't forming until like 400,000 years after the initial event, what is it that exploded, expanded, got hot, and cooled? I mean,
exactly,
what is that? I mean, we
exactly.
we don't
And
we don't
so
know.
we don't know. Well, and this is where I really want to be careful about how we use our terminology here because it can cause a lot of philosophical confusion. Um, and where empirical inquiry can take us. And so, for example, in this case, we have a lot of, I'm a fan of empirical inquiry as one of the primary means we have to try to and I want to underscore, try to understand the universe that we live in, because how else are we going to understand it except for, divine revelations in our own brains, which we can't empirically test. But I also think empirical inquiry has its limits. In particular, things that we can't test, right, are not subject to empirical inquiry. And so, empirical inquiry, insofar as we believe it as a way to know things, and I'm sort of, I'm thinking deep into sort of ancient philosophers, all the way up to like Hume in terms of how they think about empirical inquiry, can take us pretty far back, right? We have very strong evidence, almost irrefutable evidence that the Big Bang happened, unless we want to come up with an incredibly contrived other version of how we could come up with the evidence that we have. So we have incredibly strong, like watertight as you can get, empirical evidence that the Big Bang happened. But we have almost nothing before that. We can push in physics laboratories, we can push to physical conditions that recreate, we think, the energetics of the universe at very, very young times. But beyond that, we're left to sort of theory. And we can push theory back to very early times, almost possibly as far back as what's called the Planck time, which comes from quantum mechanics. It's roughly 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds, if you don't happen to have that memorized. It's very, very young. But once we hit what's called the Planck time, our theory doesn't even take us farther than that because our current understanding of physics literally breaks down. And so empirical inquiry takes us to a point, theory takes us to yet a different point, and then we hit a wall where our theory can't even take us. And then past that, we could try to take philosophy, but then we hit a wall where philosophy can't even take us because we end up in infinite regression. And so there are sort of different stages of I would say understanding where the universe came from.
So it seems once we get past Planck time, Kelsey, I've always run into this. You're suddenly into the language of. I like to say this colloquially that the ancient church or the church, the more modern church, had a garage sale of its terminology. We just sold all of our theological terms to scientists, and now they're using them. But when you get past Planck time, what instantly comes up are things like the words eternal and infinite. I think that's always been telling for me, not as a smoking gun for God, but if you can't help but use that kind of language, one wonders which came first. It's like, the Robert Jastrow quote. There's for centuries, scientists have been climbing the mount of improbabilities, about to ascend to the highest peak, and they get to the top and they see that there is a band of theologians that have been sitting there for centuries. That's in his book, God and the Astronomers. But there is a convergence there. I mean, you mentioned this in several places in your book about theology, philosophy, and science kind of coming together at this point. And I'm not the first to say this, and I don't know where I heard it, but there's this running idea that I just slipped my head. I hate when squirrels take the nut of my thought and run
I know.
with it.
I'm with you.
Drives me crazy. But that, oh yeah, here it is. That physics cosmologists only ask for one miracle, and then they can explain everything else. You talk about the violation or the breaking down of known physical laws. In theological and philosophical language, that's almost miraculous in some sense. It just depends. But here, as you point out in the book, we're getting into what seems like maybe semantics, but really what you're saying is, finally that we need to be clear about our terms when we're discussing these things. And I've learned this especially in talking to atheists and Christians and people of other religions in my job. We're not always we have the same sounding words, but we have radically different definitions of what those words are. And so it's necessary to understand what we're all thinking about this. And about empiricism, I wanted to make the point, I think you do somewhere, maybe it's in epistemology chapter, or maybe it's just in the back of my head, but the idea that empiricism itself is not subject to empiricism. I mean, in other words, we can't use empiricism to demonstrate that that's the only way to know something about reality. And I think that was the problem with positivism in the early 19th century, the logical positivists who tried to make sure everything that they said was provable by empirical means, but you can't do that. So it seems that we are at a point of sort of a veil here with the beginning. And you mentioned it earlier in the beginning, we talk about when theists, or as someone contemplating these ideas, that we don't want to just make the move that God did it, because this is kind of a God of the gaps fallacy. And as a Christian, I've been accused of this. Ray, God did it. What, are you just God of the gapping everything? And to me, I just say, well, you can explain, you can have a physical explanation for something, but there's two different kinds of explanations in a general sense. One is, why is the coffee here? Well, you could say you made it, or you could explain it by the mechanics of how we boil water and grow coffee beans. And they're both valid explanations, but one doesn't cancel out the other. So for me, I avoid the God of the gaps by saying you can find all the fantastic scientific information you can about the universe, and I can still think that God was behind that all. And that's not really a God of the gaps. The God of the gaps that we're talking about, the fallacy, is actually saying, well, God did it. Let's not examine the why and the how, right? Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, I think you and I would be in agreement on this, right? It's using a higher power. I would say the God of the gaps fallacy for me is using a higher power as an explanation for something we don't understand.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Which is very, I think, substantively different from inferring there is a higher power regardless
Exactly.
of our understanding.
Right. Do you think in your field that there is I'll just kind of put it colloquially, a naturalism of the gaps? Well, we don't have to have God. We can just, everything can be explained naturally.
I think I don't know how pervasive that is, but I certainly think that is present. And there's, this is where, as you said, our use of language becomes, you know, language is both powerful and undermining at the same time, because I think
Can
we
be,
can
yeah.
mean different things by that.
Hmm.
And there's a real difference between um, saying we can explain everything via science, um, and therefore it's everything is within the realm of the natural world, and there's no need for the supernatural, but you still end up with this existential why do we have anything to begin with question.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think there can be a bit of a naturalist fallacy for sure.
Yeah.
I
You
don't know
say,
how
and
pervasive it is, so I want to be a little
yeah,
bit
no, of
cautious.
course. It's hard to generalize about a large swath of people because you're always going to find outliers and always going to find people that say, well, that's not true. That's not what we all think. Now, I want to talk about your chapter on epistemology a little bit. I mean, we've kind of have been talking about it indirectly, but on 268, I highlighted this yesterday morning because as you're delving into the what determines the laws of nature,
Mhm.
you say, you ask of us, I ask that you try to trust me for a few pages. And so I
Mhm.
highlighted that, and I think, and I have a marginal note there that that's the heart of epistemology. It's
Mhm.
not so much the information that's present before us. It's a matter of an act of trust that if you want to learn anything, that you're going to have to trust, you're going to have to you're going to have to put an active trust into the source from whom or from what you're learning, a dictionary, a human
Yes.
being, a professor. And so that's not even on the table sometimes when we discuss science. Do I trust this science popularizer? Do I trust this guy? Do I trust this atheist or this Christian apologist? Well, they all have agendas. Why should I'm distrustful of people with the paradigmatic agendas, that there's something deeper behind what they're talking about.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about that trust. That we
Oof.
I know it's a biggie, but when we're talking about ultimate meaning and where we all came from and why is this all here, really at the base level of all this discussion, Kelsey, is a matter of trusting the sources from which we are hearing this information.
Yes, I so agree with you on this. When I'm teaching this material in class, and in particular when I'm teaching epistemology in class, one of the exercises I have my students do, and I would invite all of us to do, I think this is actually really important to leading an examined life, is list all of the sources of information that they have, parents, teachers, professors, news of this kind, news of that kind, friends, whatever it is, right? List all of the ways that you get information that you may or may not believe. And then, try to take an honest step back and ask yourself, how confident are you that that source is not misleading you in some way? Look at their agendas, look at their underlying motivations, look at where they got their information, right? How confident are you in that source of information? Because at the end of the day, to make progress, I think in anything, we have to decide what sources of information we trust, right? Because otherwise, we don't as humans have the time or the ability to learn everything on our own. We have to trust sources of information. But who or what do you trust and why? And when would you not trust them and why? And I think this is at the core of how so many different belief systems come into being, right? You, for example, Dan, I know you have chosen to put your trust in certain things for reasons, right? And I don't necessarily need to know what those reasons are, and likewise, I have done the same. And I think many people do it without. Here, I'm making a generalization that I can't back up, so I have to be a little bit careful here. My suspicion, and I don't know this to be true, is that many people sort of end up putting trust in things without examining how trustworthy those things
Oh,
are.
that. I think you're absolutely spot on. That's life experience. We all have people in our lives that are like
Right.
that.
I just want to be careful that I don't have
We've
data
been
on
there.
this, right?
We can
I
say
don't want
we've
to.
done it. We can say we've done it, right?
Exactly. We have done it. And I think that can lead us to really dangerous places.
Hmm.
And, you'll read in the book, one of the things I do when my students I ask them to tell me things that they know. And again, with little prompting, because I want to see what they come up with. And often, there will always be a student who says, like, well, I know that my name is Jennifer. And well, okay, it's not always Jennifer, to be clear. It'd be Bob, whatever it is. Um, And I'll ask them, well, what is your evidence for that? Right. And they'll be, oh, my parents told me, or it's on my birth certificate. And I'm like, well, are you going to tell me that your parents have never lied to you? Right? Are you 100% sure that you can always trust everything your parents have said? Because as a mother of three, um, I'm pretty sure that every parent in the history of the universe has lied to their children,
Well,
right?
Santa
It's
Claus,
just
right? The trauma that
exactly.
comes from
Wait, are you
being
telling me
8 or 9
Santa Claus
and
isn't
seeing
true?
mom and
Um,
dad hiding presents under the tree. You're like, wait a minute, that's not Santa Claus.
and so to really take an honest assessment of what you trust and why you trust it is so important to making progress in our understanding of the universe that we live in. And there are things that I think are so easy to take as self-evident, right? Is how could you possibly not believe this to be true? um, that actually, when you look under the hood, gets a little bit dicey. So, for example, when I'm doing this exercise with my students of asking them what they know, and they'll tell me something and I'll push back on them, and they'll be like, "Oh, I guess I don't really know that." And it's a totally infuriating game, and they get super frustrated with me. And finally, a clever student will say something mathematical, like, "I know 1 + 1 = 2."
Ah,
Like,
you
how
don't
could
know
that
about
not be
Bertrand
true?
Russell's proof, or is it
Exactly, right? And so then I'm like, "Well,
300
let's
pages?
unpack
Is
this.
it?
How do you know 1 + 1 = 2?" Well, it turns out it took Bertrand and it took uh in Principia Mathematica, it took over 300 pages to prove it, and even that proof is based on assumptions, right?
Yep.
So I really want people to be questioning what they put their trust in.
Even Gödel with his theorem,
Exactly.
sets are incomplete. Inside
Yep.
sets that we take axiomatically for granted are things that we cannot prove. And then
Absolutely.
I don't know what page it's on, but you list a page length equation that I think is all encompassing of the four fundamental forces.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that's fantastic. Now, you credit the person
That
who,
was a risk. I have to say that was a risk putting that in the
well,
book,
it
because if you
struck me
open up the
because
book to that,
you have in the caption under that, you have the person that painstakingly transcribed that, and I, being someone who has written a book where there's mathematical and scientific symbols in it, and I have to edit these things, there's just no word processing that makes that easy. It's just not. So congratulations for getting all that in the book, and you must have sent your editors into the stratosphere trying to make sure that was all correct. But you,
well, I'm sure you've heard that every time you put an equation in the book, like, sales are supposed to go down. And I was like, whatever,
yes,
I'm
I've
not
heard that.
writing this for sales, right? I'm
Right?
writing this
No,
because
right?
I want people to read it. So please do, right? Please,
Yeah.
anyone who's listening, please read it. I don't care if you buy it, but read it. Um, but sometimes we need equations, right? I don't mean to
How
sound
did
like
that
super
translate into
intellectual
the
here.
audiobook, by the way? I'm sorry for interrupting my squirrels. How did that did you read that in the audiobook, or did you just
No,
have a
no, no. I
PDF?
think I'm trying to remember if there's a supplemental PDF
There
that goes
is.
with
I
the
have the
audiobook.
audiobook, so that must be what
Yeah.
it was.
And I'm trying to remember if we included it there or not. I don't remember.
But I bring that up because there's a couple of things that I want to tie into that you can get into. You talk about on page 302 an individual that by the name of Alfred Tarski.
Mm.
He proposed that the host predicates for true and false, things that we say are true and false in everyday language and experience, are preceded by what he calls a meta language. So
Mhm.
it's hard to talk about language when we are in language, much as it's the same way for a fish to talk about what water is like because he's in the water, or talking about time inside of time when we want to get outside of time. It seems both
Yep.
language and time have predicates. We at least in our striving to understand them, at least come to the position that there must be something meta. We always think in terms of meta. Well, what's outside of our language? What is beyond language? You talk about information and black holes, the equation itself. Just taking that as an example, you have the individual who transcribed it in the footnotes there. I forgot what her name was, but that was a what we might call a scribal transmission of mathematical language that seems
Mhm.
to be woven into the fabric of the universe. And
Mhm.
it reminded me of a quote from Alexander Vilenkin in his book Many Worlds. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said that if mathematics, and he's not a theist, this is the conclusion of the book. He says if mind is the medium of mathematics, and law, which is mathematically based, physics law and cosmology, is mathematical by nature. It seems that, according to Vilenkin's thought experiment, mind does mind predate the universe? If the laws are there before the universe, if you want to say before in a weird way, does the medium of mathematics suggest that there was a mind before the universe that came up with the meta language, if you will, of mathematics of our universe? How do you see mathematics as evidence either for or against the existence of a higher power in relation to the cosmos?
Oof.
It's a big
Well,
one.
I'm really glad you brought up Tarski here, and I think the same the same 5 minutes as you brought up Gödel, and all of this to me is, I think, very, very interrelated. Um, I will confess that I am of the belief, I will say belief and not knowledge, but I'm of the belief that the fundamental language of our universe is math. And I
Galileo
don't mean
thought so too.
yeah, and I don't mean contrived human math.
No,
Obviously,
no, no.
there
Right,
are,
right, right, right,
symbols
right.
and equations and stuff that humans have
Sure,
invented.
sure.
But I am absolutely of the opinion that as we find new mathematical truths about the universe, that we are discovering them as opposed to inventing them. And that is definitely a debate that's out there. And so I want to be clear that there are two sides to that. But I really do believe that we are discovering these mathematical truths. And so to me, that suggests, right, that there's some sort of underlying mathematical construct, almost an architecture from which, our universe or universes um, can be allowed to happen. Now, where that mathematical language comes from, and whether that is from a higher power, I don't have the answer to, but I do think a lot about both Goodell and um, and Tarski in this situation, right? So I love that you brought up Tarski. Like no one ever picks up on Tarski. He's like, I like, and I guess because it becomes so kind of deeply nerdy to be talking about symbolic language, which was Tarski's forte, but to be really thinking about the philosophy of symbolic language and how when you are in a system, there's a limit to what you can know to be true or false because you can't define those things within a system. Um, and so then you require this meta language, but then that meta language requires a meta language. And so we end up back in an infinite regression. But this is where philosophically, for me, really the rubber hits the road. And I think for many people who think about this through a theist perspective, the rubber hits the road because when we have an infinite regression, right? So let's say I could tell you with certainty the universe is based on math. Then the next question might be, well, where did that math come from, right? And who or what created that math? And then the next question might be, well, who or what created the thing that created that math, right? So we end up in this infinite regression. And I will tell you, thinking about infinite regression keeps me up, I would say, more nights than not. I think about it a lot, probably more than is healthy. And a lot of people will then retort that, well, the solution to infinite regression is obvious. It's that things have just always existed, right? And things are what they are. And why do you need to have a beginning to why things are what they are? But to me, I find that explanation, I can't rule it out, and I need to be intellectually honest about that. But I find it very, very deeply unfulfilling for a couple of reasons. But one of them is, well, one, I just like things to have explanations because I'm a scientist. Um, but two, it leads to a whole other Pandora's box of, okay, if I were to take it as given that we've always had this something, or that math has always existed, or that whatever it is that created that math has always existed, why that thing and not some other thing? Why this universe and not some other universe? Why this amount of stuff and not some other amount of stuff? And so I find it very philosophically unsatisfying. I realize I've taken we've gone off on a trail off in the woods here, but all of these things are related to me. And but they suggest to me at the end of the day, and I guess this is where I'll tie a bow on this. Um, they suggest to me that when we go down this line of thought, There are things that at least we humans are not currently capable of understanding. That's not to say we will never be capable of understanding it. And if we are not currently capable of understanding it, we have to leave open possibilities. And those possibilities include things that I'm sure you and I and whoever might be listening will think of. But I think we also, and this is critical for me, because of availability error, right, and because we tend to think of possibilities that we tend to think of, right, which is kind of a tautology, we have to always leave open the possibility for something we haven't thought of yet.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Now, this doesn't mean that I know everything, but there tends to be in our knowledge, Kelsey, that whether we're theists or not, I see this in my own field, apologetics. I will tell you that I love apologetics. I love the defense of the Christian faith. That's what's kept me in the faith, kept me from
Mhm.
having a shallow faith. But I will say of my own field, and I'm making a hasty generalization here, apologists can sometimes be generally perceived as know-it-alls, and we carry that aura of "I've got God all figured out," because we are oftentimes tasked to answer questions that people have about God, and so we feel the burden of having to be God's public relations people. But if you
Mhm.
look at the track record of God's public relations people in the Bible, it's not very good. And so I'm kind of that stripe. I'm more like Job's friends, who think they know everything. But in sense of being epistemically humble, I swear interacting with my unbelieving friends and talking to Mormons and Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses really does open your eyes to being epistemically humble. The necessity of being epistemically humble and being able to listen to other people. But in terms of this meta language and the logic, you talk about the lens of logic and language, both symbolic and natural, on that same page with Tarski. And I think for me, as a Christian investigating these things, the thing that makes the most sense to me, and that doesn't answer all the questions you might have, but the simple elementary school like Greek in the opening prologue of John's Gospel in the beginning was the Logos, which was in Greek thought the organizing principle of the cosmos. And so John makes this radical step in a very simple language and says that the Logos that you Greeks talk about is the Word made flesh. So the meta source of our language and logic, the meta source of the mathematics that mysteriously undergird our ability to understand the cosmos, emanates, the truth and falsehood emanate from this one particular being called the Logos, who has made flesh and dwelt among us. And that's kind of where I've landed epistemically. But I'm still, it doesn't mean that because I've landed there, that I've completely closed my mind or plugged my ears to alternative thoughts, because just because I claim to know about God doesn't mean I know everything there is to know about what God has done. And I don't want to come across as a Christian who knows everything, or I don't want to come across as a Christian who thinks he knows everything in trying to explain who God is in relation to the universe. So I appreciate dialoguing with folks like yourself to have these different perspectives, and so that I can represent different perspectives as accurately as I can. Just any thoughts on that? I'm kind of rambling here, but my squirrels are all over the place. I tend to do that.
I hear you. We've got so many squirrels running around
I
today.
know.
Um, I really appreciate that thought. One of the things that is top of mind for me often is, if at the end of the day, what we are ultimately interested in is truth, whatever that might be, then where is the harm in being curious and receptive to new information? Right. To me, it strikes me as when we become know it alls, or when we become entrenched in our ways of
It's
thinking.
just not attractive.
Well, I would agree with you on that, but I also think um it is deflective of truth, right? Because we're no longer allowing ourselves to think beyond our preconceived notions. And so for me, when people are entrenched in their position and unwilling to hear another perspective, what that signals to me is that they're not actually interested in the truth.
Right. They
And
just want
so
to
for me,
argue their
I
position.
exactly, I so value curiosity and openness, like legitimate openness. Um, because otherwise I think saying that we're interested in the truth is I think it's disingenuous.
Well, let's get into some details about the cosmos that are particularly curious. And two of which I want to talk about briefly. Time, we've already kind of talked about time a little bit, but gravity and the fundamental forces. Gravity is fascinating, and you spend some time trying to make us not take it for granted in your book. It's something as ubiquitous as the air we breathe. Cats are fascinated by it. If only we had the cat-like fascination about gravity, we just knock things off the shelf and watch them fall.
Yep.
I mean, I just think of what it would be like if the gravitational force was a little stronger. You and I would be 700-800 pounds if we lived on Jupiter or something like that. I don't know what the ratio is, but this gravitational force seems, in the language that you have in one of the chapters, finely tuned for sentient life to walk about this planet. Mm-hmm. Does that, and it's the weakest force in the universe, and yet its force falls off in relation to the distance between two massive objects, but it's the universe. It seems like the weakest force in the universe is indispensable to not only our existence, but the existence of the entire cosmos. This is a fascinating thing when you really start to think about gravity. What in the world is this business about gravity? What do you think, Kelsey?
Gravity is always this odd duck out with the known forces.
Yeah.
And, we understand gravity through empirical inquiry in a couple different ways, and we believe it to be, I want to say no, but I mean no with a lowercase k and not a capital K, right? We know it to be related to the very fabric of space-time, and how the fabric of space-time behaves. But we also need there to be this, in our current understanding of physics, we need there to be this virtual particle called a graviton that we have not yet detected, and I want to be honest about that. But gravity is, as you pointed out, it is so pervasive to our lives. If people are familiar with any of the four forces, they're probably most familiar with gravity. And yet gravity is by far like ridiculously weak. And so a lot of our thinking about the universe and how it unfolded really comes back to, why did gravity as a force sort of split off in a way that is so bizarre? And we don't have, we have some hypotheses on the table, but we don't have any answers for that yet. And this is really at the boundary of modern physics. But I want to bring this back, though, to, you alluded to fine tuning, which I think is really important. And I think where a lot of people who are in, this discussion space of theism and atheism, kind of fine tuning becomes like a magnifier for that discussion. And I think it's a really interesting case of a couple different logical fallacies that we can often fall prey to as humans. On one hand, we have the God of the gaps fallacy, which I think probably everyone listening is deeply familiar with. And on the other hand, we also have something called availability error, availability bias, which I imagine many of the listeners are also familiar with, right? Which is, we tend to think of explanations we tend to think of, but we talked about this before. And when it comes to fine tuning, often when I hear or read about debates happening, the debate is either it was luck, right? Because that's the option on the table, or it was God. And those are like the two options available to us. And I want to break down that dichotomy, because there are a lot of other options on the table that I think, if we are being intellectually honest and humble, we have to admit are possibilities. And we could go through all of them if you want. I don't know how much time you want to talk about fine tuning. There are many of them on the table, and some of them I think are actually quite compelling. And but we cannot currently test any of them, which means we can't rule them out. But one of the hypotheses that's on the table that I actually am very fond of is there's this sort of almost chauvinism about life and what we think life could be. And we humans on, this, we have this tiny little planet. We humans have evolved to be I would say, arguably intelligent, although the state of affairs sometimes causes me to question that.
Right.
Um,
Are you familiar with Carl Sagan on Johnny Carson talking about this?
no.
Oh, it's hilarious. You can look it up on YouTube. Just as an
Okay.
aside, Carson asks him, about aliens and intelligence out there, and Sagan's like, well, when we began broadcasting radio, we sent Howdy Doody and the McCarthy hearings out into space. So the first televised and radio waves that went out into space to any particular intelligent life out there would have heard Howdy Doody and the McCarthy hearings and various other things, and the audience got a laugh, But and that's the premise for Contact. The first signal that the
Yeah.
aliens get in the Star Vega is Hitler at the
It's Hitler, right?
1936
The first
Olympics.
high-powered broadcast was
Right,
Hitler,
right.
which, anyway, I think there's a lot of room
Anyway,
to debate whether or not we are or not as intelligent as we would like to think that we are. But um, the point I want to try to make is that we are very, I think, myopic and provincial in how we think about life. And and I think we need to leave open the possibility for some form of life evolving under radically different situation. And so it could very well be that in a universe with a different set of laws or a different set of physical constants, um, that life of some kind, as radically different as it might be to us, it might not even look like life. We might not even identify it as life, but that life of some kind could evolve under those conditions. And they, if this has happened and they are sitting in their own other universe with different conditions, they might be thinking the same thing we are. Like, how has our universe been so perfectly fine-tuned for our existence? And they might not possibly be able to envision life like us because we would be so radically different. So I think we need to leave open the possibility that life of some form could evolve under radically different conditions. Maybe not every possible set of conditions, but under radically different conditions. And with the anthropic principle, right? We have to necessarily find ourselves in a universe that allows for us to be here, and that could be true for any different kinds of life. So I want to be mindful that we know one planet with life, and our definition of life, actually, frankly, and you've read the chapter on ET life, is pretty crummy. We don't have a good understanding of what life even is. And so let's have some humility there. And there are lots of other explanations for let me rephrase that. There are lots of other hypotheses that could explain fine tuning as well. For example, multiple universes. Um, but again, what I would argue, um, as strongly as I can, is that if we don't know the answer, and I would argue that we don't know the answer, we have to keep all the possibilities on the table.
so we should be open minded as to some extent as Christians, even who believe that God exists, and we should be open minded as atheists, even if we believe God does not exist, in relation to an explanation. So the alternative explanations, multiverses, other evolutionary forms of life elsewhere in the cosmos, Hugh Everett's multi-worlds with the quantum wave fluctuation collapsing and creating branches of universes in other worlds where
Mhm.
there's doppelgangers of you and I somewhere.
Yep.
These are all, a lot of them are all metaphysical, and even they transcend
Yes.
empirical knowledge, which is what we were
Yes.
talking about earlier. Nothing wrong with a scientist speculating in this capacity. We're not criticizing that. But finally, I think what the fine-tuning people want to know is, like, I've heard the objection that, like you said, a common one is that, well, we're here, and if we weren't here, we wouldn't be asking these questions. But the flip side of that is, that's not really an explanation for why we're here. That ultimately still is on the table in terms of investigating it, whether you think God did it or not.
Right.
That's still a viable alternative to. As we know, if we want to talk about just empirically, we know that life only comes from life. In terms of, if we want to get purely empirical with our biology, we've only ever seen life come from life. But I think there's a miracle in naturalism, and then there's a miracle in theism, in the sense that life arises from non-life. We have this in common, at least with the resurrection of Jesus. You have life arising from a dead body. And somewhere in the back recesses of abiogenesis theory, somewhere you have life arising from non-living matter. So we share in common, it seems, that there's a common wonder and how did this happen? How could this have happened? What's the scientific explanation for the origin of life, or what's the scientific explanation for Jesus coming out of the tomb? It seems like we're still bereft of a complete omniscient kind of knowledge, which I think a lot of times we try to want to acquire. Don't you think? Sometimes science can have that overreach, or just as human beings, we want to know not so much. And I think you said it earlier, not so much for knowledge to acquire to be epistemically humble, but so that we can have enough bullets in our chamber to shoot down people that don't agree with us. I think that's kind of what I as a Christian for over 30 years, a lot of times my epistemology has been stuffing my gun with bullets so I can shoot down, and I don't mean it in a physical sense, of course.
Understood.
But just in an argumentative sense, that I want to have the intellectual tools to defeat all the arguments that come against me. But that mentality is not conducive to epistemic humility or meaningful conversations.
Yeah. I really appreciate the way you phrased that, because if our goal is to push down other explanations, I mean, in part, that is what science does, right? The goal of science is to test things and find out things that are
Sure.
appear to be not true.
Yeah. We're not saying
But
that's
to
bad.
do that without a bias, I think is one of the real challenges.
Right. Right.
And you said something I wanted to respond to, but now it's, flew out of my brain.
Squirrels.
So exactly. So maybe it will.
If it comes back, just interrupt me. Just interrupt me.
Okay.
So gravity is one of those really strange, unusual, where did this number come from kind of things. Weakest force in the universe by far, gets a lot of bad press with the other three fundamental forces. Doesn't fit, doesn't play nice with others, right? We don't know how it branched off, why it exists. Kelsey, do you think there's a particle bias in cosmology and physics? Everything seems to be, we haven't found a particle yet, but we're just going to assume that there are particles for this particular phenomenon. Am I being too cheeky?
Yes-ish, in the sense that, it's not unfounded historically, right? Historically, we do keep finding particles that represent different behaviors in the universe. And so there's a reason to believe that that is where things might go. So is there a bias in standard physics for that? Probably, but I also think that it has some historical rooting.
Okay.
But
Fair
that's
enough.
not to say
Yeah.
that I don't think we should keep and this is me being, the broken record, let's keep an open mind about other possibilities.
That's all right.
And that's where things get, I think, a little bit professionally dicey, right? Because my experience has been in the science world that there's a level of open-mindedness that is okay and is sort of embraced by the community. But there's a point at which, with many people, and again, I want to stress this is my experience and I don't want to overgeneralize, that there's a point at which one can be so open-minded that you
Your
sort of
brain's
lose
falling.
professional credibility, right?
Yeah, right.
And so that is a danger.
Sure. I think it was G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis, one of the two. They said that the point of being open-minded is so that you can have something on which to close your mind. So it's not bad to be closed-minded about the things that we hold to be true, but I think open-mindedness and the capacity with which we're talking about means the humility and the ability to listen to other people and consider other people's points of view. You might still retain your beliefs at the core, whatever they might be, but if you are confident about what you think is true, then I think that should give you the confidence to explore other things. And I think a lot of times we feel threatened as human beings, as individuals. Our core beliefs, we sometimes feel, are threatened because of things that we don't know or can't explain. And I think there's a lot of that coming from science, intentionally or otherwise, that, oh, you're not a scientist. I get that all the time. What do you know about physics? What do you know about biology? You're not a scientist. You're not this. You're not that. And I try to be the layperson's voice in this dialogue. I love science, but I'm not a scientist. I write about the cosmos, but I'm not a cosmologist. And I continually have to find myself engaged with to represent the discipline and the points of view honestly and sincerely without strawmanning them or condemning people or coming across as combative. because I like to talk about these things. But a lot of people are intimidated by science, Kelsey. And I know in the debates,
Really?
yeah, really, could you tell? In the Christian atheist debate, atheists throw science at Christians, Christians throw science at atheists, and there within Christendom there are a couple of different camps of scientific points of view, old Earth, young Earth. And so it just seems like we just sometimes in our own biases like to just appeal to science, and we really don't even know what the things to which we are appealing. Oh, look, science says that there was a big bang. Oh, look, science says dark matter, dark energy. Oh, look what science says. See, your God is irrelevant. And I see that going in both directions, that we are quoting science for our particular biases.
And this actually, I have a very fraught relationship with this because on one hand, yes, I do want people to embrace empirical inquiry as one way of helping us understand our place in the universe. But when science becomes used and misused, I would say, not when it's used properly, but when it is misused as ammunition, it starts to make me very, very uncomfortable. And, this gets back to our early part of our earlier conversation. We were talking about trust and what sources of knowledge you trust, who you trust, and why you trust them. And this is something that is really challenging for me as a scientist because as a scientist, right, I don't mean this to sound in any way sort of arrogant, but right, we've learned a lot of stuff. We've had a lot of school, and there are a lot of subtleties and things that are hard to explain if you haven't spent, decades entrenched in the material and the thinking and the data and what it means and what it doesn't. That are, I think, are can be hard for people outside of the field to understand. And what this often leads to, and I feel like this is a real pity because people who are genuinely curious and want to understand the universe and our place in it have a little bit of scientific knowledge, enough scientific knowledge to sort of, I would say, almost be problematic because they know enough to think they know something, but not enough to actually know something. And and then they can speak the language and they can sound like they know what they're talking about and they can convince people to believe them, but they don't actually really understand what they're talking about. And I encounter this all the time and it drives me crazy because on one hand I want to embrace them and say I love that you're thinking about this and that you're bringing science and empirical inquiry into the conversation, but you need to understand that you, with your background and your training, are not seeing the whole picture and you're misrepresenting what some of the science is saying or our understanding of the science. And that's really painful for me. And when I see science misrepresented, especially as a means of ammunition, it drives me absolutely nuts because I feel like I feel like it's unethical.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is human nature to use something to weaponize. And again, this goes, I think, the weaponization of anything, be it church or God or science, I think is systemic of the bigger problem of not living the examined life. I mean, if you are confident in what you believe, you don't have to weaponize the church or the Bible or a science textbook or anything to prove your point. And I think social media, unfortunately, exacerbates the weaponization of institutions today. Let's talk about
Go ahead.
briefly, since we're on this topic of knowledge and epistemic humility and our place in the cosmos. One of the things that comes up in these debates, Kelsey, and I was asked this at one of my book clubs a couple of months ago. A gentleman said that he had become an atheist because of this very question. If God exists, Dan, why did he make the universe so big and us so incredibly tiny? What is all this universe stuff? It doesn't seem like he needed to do all this. It just seems like an exorbitant waste. I've heard this a lot, not just from my friend there at the club. The universe is so big, therefore God doesn't exist, kind of thing. And I said, well, if God exists and he created the universe, he was not on a budget, right? I mean, he has all the materials he needs to do whatever he wants to do. It's kind of like the Burj Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. If they just wanted to build an apartment complex or an office building, they could have done something much similar. So why the Burj? Why is it the tallest thing in the world, and why does it look the way it does? Well, there's more there than just occupancy, isn't it? It's just for the glory of Dubai, the kingdom of Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. This is what we can do. So it's more than just occupancy, and I think, and that's what I kind of shared with him, that the universe is more than just about its human occupants. So in one sense, From a secular perspective, a lot of people will hear, and I know Carl Sagan was probably one of the people who popularized this idea of our cosmic insignificance, that he derives the idea of human insignificance from our relative size to the rest of the universe. And I will
Mm-hmm.
agree, there's no argument that we're small in comparison to the rest of the universe. But the idea that of our significance does not seem to follow from just size, right? It just seems like there is a significant. I mean, we don't act like we're insignificant. We certainly don't as human beings.
Maybe we should.
Maybe we should. I mean, a couple of years ago, COVID, that tiny little thing, that was very small, but it wasn't insignificant. It shut down the planet. So how do we? How do you address this issue of the topic of our significance or insignificance in the
Mm-hmm.
cosmos? How do we determine whether or not human beings have a special or an insignificant place in the universe? What do you think?
There's a lot to unpack there. I tried to take some notes because I don't want these squirrels to run out of my brain as
Oh, that's
they
okay.
keep
Just
keep doing. So one thing that I really believe to be true, and for me um, is deeply impelling, is that at least right now. All right, let me step back. From a scientific perspective, we are literally molecules and atoms, many of which were made and forged in stars, right? That have been put together through evolution. And whether or not a higher power had a hand in that, I'm just going to set to the side, right? Because that's not something we know. Um, that have become sentient. And as far as we know right now, and maybe this will change tomorrow, maybe it'll change the next decade, but as far as we know right now, we are the only living beings in the universe. We are the only sentient, we are the universe made sentient, and we are the only sentient beings in the universe right now that we know of that are capable of even trying to understand the universe that we are in. Which in a physical sense, right? If we're talking about the physical universe, in a real sense, we are the universe made self-aware, which to me makes us yes, insignificant in many ways, but incredibly significant. We are the universe itself trying to understand itself, which to me is profound and leaves me with an ethical compulsion to try to understand the universe that we're living in, because we are the universe itself, and that is what I believe to be true. And so when I am deep as an astrophysicist staring into the abyss of our apparent insignificance in the universe and how unfathomably small we are and perhaps physically insignificant, I am reminded that we are the universe made self-aware, and to me, that is huge, right? And it's almost for me, if we are the only beings in the universe ever to become sentient and capable of trying to understand the universe, if we blow it, right? If we destroy ourselves or don't survive or whatever we do, that is like a profound shame. I don't think that even I don't even know how to explain how tragic I feel that situation would be. And so I think we are very significant in that sense, at least as far as we know right now. So that's one way that I think about it. Um, the other thing I want to come back to, though, in terms of you mentioned an atheist member of your book club who talked about the size of the universe being evidence for a lack of a creator. One of the things that's really interesting to me is how I have found people respond to there being a higher power of some sort, and I don't want to ascribe to one form of a higher power or another. Really depends on how we think about it. And so, for example, I wonder how that member would have would have thought about it in this other scenario that I want to share now. So, one of the scenarios on the table, and there's a whole philosophical um, line of reasoning that leads to this, is that it's very possible that our universe is some kind of an experiment or a simulation, um, and in which either a super intelligent sort of extraterrestrial race or some kind of a higher power, whatever that is, whether it's actually sort of a higher power that lives within what we might call the natural world or the supernatural world, I think is a matter of debate, created our universe as an experiment to see what would happen or if life would emerge. In which case you would need potentially a very large, possibly infinite universe to enable conditions for life to emerge. And so if we are thinking about a higher power, and I really want to stress the if here, right? If we are thinking about a higher power as, not a conventional God of perhaps the Hebrew Bible, but as a higher power doing an experiment and requiring a large universe to do their experiment, then the size of the universe becomes sort of naturally explained. And so I think there's a lot of, it's really interesting to me psychologically how people would respond to the existence and what we know about the universe, depending on how we think of a higher power. And for many people, the fine tuning issues, the size of the universe issues, many of the things we might debate in a theist or atheist conversation, the lens through which we view those changes depending on how we're thinking about a higher power.
Hmm. I think the analogy, I've used the analogy myself of telescopes. The original telescopes, what'd you have to do? You had to close one eye to look through it. And I remember, reading about Galileo when he first made the telescope. People distrusted looking into it because they thought it was, bewitched or something. And there's the story, I don't know how true it is, where the astronomer William Herschel was building one of his large telescopes. And it's true historically that King George III, the king of the American Revolution, was William and Caroline Herschel's patron. He paid for a lot of the equipment that they made. And the story goes that Herschel was constructing one of his huge tubes, and King George came to see what was going on, and Herschel says, "Come with me, King, and I will show you the way to the glory of God." And they supposedly walked through the tube. So I don't know what that might be, but the early astronomers certainly had the inspiration to investigate the cosmos because of they believed it was God had created it, and they can learn more about God from what they studied. But from a secular or a non-theistic point of view, the universe, the fabric of space and time, seems to invite inquiry nonetheless. Why are things the way they are? And it seems like if God exists, he has provided jobs for a lot of people over the centuries in terms of just the cosmos by itself. You could argue that. So we're going to wrap up here in a minute. I wanted to briefly ask you a burning question I've had about time and Albert Einstein. And I think it's in your book, so I know it was something. But as I was reading the chapter about Einstein, or about time in general, and the special relativity, a couple of questions came to mind. One is the 300,000 meters per second speed limit of the speed of light. And if special relativity is true, from what clock does that second come? That's the first question. And number two, is Einstein's theory of special relativity saying that time itself is relative, or is it saying that our representation or understanding of time is relative?
Oh, okay. There's a lot to talk about.
So that might be another hour. I don't know if you can do that in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, but
and really what we need is a whitewboard so I can
sure.
I know
this is a hard medium to explain all these difficult things, but
yeah, so time is such a slippery concept, and relativity really brought some new and interesting ways to think about it. But in relativity, the speed of light as we know it to be, I do want to talk about that though, because the speed of light itself is actually really interesting. The speed of light is, we can measure the speed of light with clocks here on Earth, and we have very advanced clocks here on Earth that are human contrivances, and we have defined what a second is, and I want to be clear about all of that. But regardless of what clock we use with what units, wherever we use it, as far as we can tell, and we can tell this with a high degree of confidence in a lot of different situations, the speed of light is always the same everywhere. For whatever that local, for whatever the clocks are that you use to measure it. So it doesn't matter where the clock is, it is always going to measure the speed of light to be the same. But what's really interesting under the hood here for me is something that actually gets deep into what the speed of light is. And I don't know how common it is for normal people to think about the speed of light and why we have the speed of light and why the speed of light is what it is, which, to be clear, is an open question. But the speed of light itself is kind of a red herring. What the speed of light is, which we denote with this the lowercase c in physics equations, all it really is a translation between the dimensions of space and the dimension of time. And 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 how we translate between those two dimensions. And that's where it comes from. And so one of the things that to me really illustrates this in a way that sometimes my students find a little bit jaw dropping. So maybe you will, or maybe the listeners will, to get a sense of the speed of light. You may have heard that if anything is moving at the speed of light in space, it doesn't experience time, right? Time stops for it, which is really interesting to try to get your head around. What does it mean for light to not experience time? But the flip side of that is that um, everything, including you and I sitting here in our chairs and our offices, is moving at the speed of light. But because we are mostly stationary, right? If we neglect the Earth spinning and the all the other motions that's happening, things that are sitting still in space are moving at the speed of light through time. And so everything is actually moving at the speed of light, but the speed of light is the translation between how fast you're moving in time and how fast you're moving in space. And so, to me, it's a different angle to think about where this comes from. But in terms of relativity, because this is baked in, we don't have a choice. We are always moving at we don't have a choice as far as we know. We are always moving at the speed of light through space time, no matter what. And it doesn't matter what clock you have or where that clock is or how fast your clock is moving, it is always going to see that.
Okay. So the idea is really at the basement of all this. It seems that our universe, our foundational understanding of the universe, is based on light. No light, no information, no knowledge. We don't know anything about stars, planets, nebula, asteroids, each other. I mean, we are radiant beings. You put on the night vision goggles and you can see our infrared stuff. And especially when I start talking, you can see the infrared of my heat going up. A lot of gas coming out of my mouth, But anyway, we are talking about light as a fundamental property of the universe, right? This is without light, we don't have anything.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far.
Okay.
I think we humans, we are so visually oriented, at least for people who are seeing. And our visual cortex is so dominant in our brains. It is easy for us to equate light with all forms of information. Light, if I take a step back as a physicist, light is just a manifestation of one of the four known forces in the universe, right? It's a manifestation of electromagnetism. The other forces have signatures as well. So, for example, even if we weren't seeing creatures, you could imagine a universe in which, or a place in our universe in which some kind of life, which is terribly defined, um, evolved to perceive gravitational waves, right, in a way that we haven't. And so that would be another form of information. So as humans, we have evolved to think of light as the primary form of information that we get about the universe, because as humans, it is the primary way in which we get information about the universe. And goodness knows, astronomers are scavengers of light, right? Almost everything we know about the universe is from light. And so we're very light dependent. But that's only the manifestation of one of the four forces. Um, and so we have to be a little bit careful about our own bias here that I think many people aren't even aware of, right? We're not even aware about our bias toward light. And so on one hand, what you're saying is correct in the sense that as humans, most of what we understand about the universe is from light. But there are a lot of other ways and lenses through which one might understand the universe if we had evolved differently.
Okay. Now, speaking of light, and we'll wrap up here, and my friend Bill, who is our Atheist and Christian Book Club co-host, who is also part of the Atheist Book Club I'm a part of in Dallas. Bill is an atheist. He was a former Christian. And last year, I had mentioned something offhandedly at our in-person meeting about Richard Feynman and the fine structure constant. And Feynman quipped, and I'm paraphrasing here, it may be that God pushed his pencil and we don't know, what he was up to. But Feynman was, like Wolfgang Pauli before him, thoroughly befuddled by the 1 over 137, the fine structure constant, the energy levels between electrons as it buzzes around the nucleus of an atom. And it's not just in the energy levels of electrons, but it has something to do with the orbital velocity of an electron versus the speed of light. I think is the ratio is it's 101 over 1 over 37, and there's also wavelength differences between this. This is a phenomenal number, and nobody knows. I say nobody. I'm being, from what I understand, nobody seems to know, or you can't. There's nothing you can do to calculate to get this number, but you need this number to do calculations. And nobody really knows why it is, it seems. The way I'm understanding it, and I'm not saying I understand it completely, but my friend Bill is befuddled by the 1 over 137th, the fine structure constant, and as I understand it, there's no carbon. There's no triple alpha process that Hoyle described without the fine structure constant. So maybe we can wrap up and leave it at this mystery, Kelsey. Does this bespeak of a creator, or is this just a fluke of nature?
All right, do we have another hour?
I had to do this for Bill, and I'm sorry I waited so long.
The fine structure constant is really interesting. So the first thing I want to say is the 1 over 137 is an approximation. It is not exactly 1 over 137.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because I think if you were to believe it was exactly 1 over 137, you'd be like, why is that? That's weird. So it's not exactly 1 over 137, but it is actually, it's a relationship between how an electron orbits and the speed of light and the Planck constant. And so the fine structure constant is actually a manifestation of a relationship between all of these other constants. Now, why any of those constants have the values that they do is an open question. But I wouldn't say the fine structure constant is more or less mystifying than any of the other things that are in that equation, including the speed of light.
Okay.
And so, but why any of them have the values that they do is an open question. And this drives us as physicists crazy because we like to know why. And this leads us back into our earlier conversation about fine tuning. But one of the things we don't know, and this is maybe a little bit about the Feynman quote, and we have to be mindful of, is we don't know what range any of these constants, including the fine structure constant, could have had, right? If they could have had any value between 0 and infinity, then of course it is very interesting, let me say, that it has a value of 1 over 137 that happens to allow for life as we know it. But what if there's physics we don't understand, another level down, that maybe the fine structure constant, for reasons we don't know yet, had to have a value between 1 over 100 and 1 over 200, right? And we don't know what's constraining the value that it had. And so we have to be open-minded that there might be, could the universe be fine-tuned by a higher power to enable life as we know it? Sure, I can't rule that. I think we also have to be equally mindful that could these constants have the values that they do because of physics that we don't yet understand? We've got to leave that open too.
Okay. It reminds me of videos I've seen online. I grew up listening to Van Halen. It was my first concert that I ever went to when I was a teenager.
Oh, no.
I don't know why my parents let me go to the Cow Palace in San Francisco in 1984 to see Van Halen, but I did. It was a fun experience for a teenager, but I was deaf for 3 days, and I was like, well, that's the lifestyle I wanted to pursue. But anyway, as an adult, it's fascinating. There are people on YouTube who have spent hours, I've seen these videos, trying to recreate the sound of Eddie Van Halen's amplifier and guitar. And they're videos that they go into all the science of what they know that Eddie left behind to try to recreate what he called the Brown sound of his guitar. But it boils down to, here's an amplifier with dials, here's an electric current regulator, and this kind of guitar, these kinds of strings, this kind of pedal, and all this kind of stuff. And people are listening to the original recordings of Van Halen, of Eddie's Eruption, trying to figure out how did he get this guitar sound. But the premise behind that is kind of similar to fine tuning. I think that you make it in the book, the idea of God with dials, And why would he dial it this way, and why would he dial it that way? And if we dialed it a different way, what kind of sound would we get? We'd certainly get some kind of sound. But it seems like the more you dial down these basic constants, if you said there's like 20 of them or something, but the more you dial these, the less of the periodic table we have, until we get all the way down to maybe just helium if the dials were adjusted a certain way. So it does seem odd that I know the opposition, the pushback from non-theists about the fine-tuning argument that Christians offer is that why would God need to finely tune life this way? If God was God, he could do whatever he wanted, however he wanted. That seems to be the argument, that God doesn't need dials. He could just make life out of sand if he wanted to. Why does he need dials? But for me, I think the idea of these constants and quantities show the mathematical genius of the Logos. And I like to think, and we'll wrap up here, Kelsey, that in 1 Corinthians, Paul's talking about God, and he says that God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong or are wise. And I think of gravity in that same capacity, that all of the mind-blowing things that we physicists know, they're driven crazy by actually trying to figure out what gravity is. And so God,
I love that you just tied gravity into 1 Corinthians and Van Halen. That is not how I expect this to end.
Well, there you go. I'll leave that for you to have the last word on any of that.
No, that's I don't know if I can say it better than you, right? There's this is me being a broken record. Really, it just all comes down to intellectual humility and being honest with ourselves, even if we're not honest with the outside world, about what we really know and what we don't know, and who we trust and why we trust it, and being open to curiosity. And I think that's the path forward for us as humans.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelsey. I appreciate that. We like to ask our guests, and you'll probably be asked this on the club, but any advice for atheists and Christians? Well, I think you've given it. You've given it multiple times. I think that's the best advice for both of us, both camps, is intellectual humility.
Yeah. I mean, that's the advice I would give to every human, right?
Yeah.
Insofar as I'm ordained to give any advice at all. And it's not
Right.
to say that I don't ever, sin on this myself. And, there are certainly moments when I lack the intellectual humility that I would like to have. But it's something to aspire to.
Yeah. I mean, when we get challenged, that's just our nature to want to fight back with our knowledge bullets and shoot each other. It's unfortunate, but hopefully the dialogue can, hopefully, if nothing else, if you don't believe in God or you don't believe in God, that our conversation will encourage you to have better dialogue with other people. And that's what we need today, I think, is better dialogue with each other.
Oh, so true.